mean, that is the land of unconfirmed reports.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, oh, I'm sure it did.
So the mainstream media, and sadly far too much of YouTube, they're currently filling the airwaves with just nonstop imperialist propaganda on the subject of Russia and Ukraine. The prevailing narrative is this one-sided black and white affair where Putin is like this arch evil top villain. And he's, bent on reestablishing some kind of Russian or Soviet empire. And he's willing to, topple other nations, to achieve this goal. Unfortunately, the world is a much more complex and filled with shades of gray. It's not black and white at all. And this conflict is the result of years of NATO provocations and expansion eastward, at the behest of American imperialism as well as Western oligarchs. So this video, we'll break down, we'll go through a basic run through of the expansions of NATO, the provocations of NATO as well. And then hopefully we'll have a deeper understanding of how we got here, which will hopefully help us understand how we can get the hell out of here. It's really important that we de-escalate in a situation like this, where this conflict can lead to much larger wars, regional, even global, and could possibly result in, nuclear weapons being used. And that's not hyperbole. So let's break this down a little bit. So first, we have a video here. I think this kind of perfectly lays the groundwork of where we want to start. And then we can expand from there. I don't know where my remote is. Oh, well. I think it's loud enough. Let's see. So, yeah, I think this video here lays down the groundwork kind of perfectly. I'll make sure it's nice and loud, yeah. All right, here we go.
The administration says the beginning of a Russian invasion is underway. The head of NATO says they have hundreds of warships standing by in the Mediterranean Sea. Things are spiraling out of control. So how did we get here? The media explanation is basically Putin evil. But this explanation leaves out the core of the issue, which is NATO's expansion. NATO, which is short for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was originally formed at the beginning of the Cold War as an anti-Soviet military alliance composed of the US and Western European powers. Now, one might have thought that since the Soviet Union dissolved and is no longer socialist, there would no longer be a need for a NATO. But instead of disbanding, the NATO alliance actually expanded after the Cold War into several countries that were once part of the Soviet Union, although it rejected including Russia itself. For decades, basically all political figures in Russia, not just Putin, have objected to this NATO expansion as a repurposed military alliance aimed at encircling Russia. NATO claims it's a defensive alliance, but after the Cold War, NATO went on to topple the governments of Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Libya.
Just making sure you're following along here. One of the primary reasons for the conflict we are seeing right now is the expansion of NATO. And NATO is indeed a hostile alliance that has done offensive wars. Let's continue.
In this history, Russia fears that it'll be the next target. Furthermore, Russia's demand that NATO stop its expansion isn't exactly unreasonable, considering NATO countries made several promises that the NATO alliance wouldn't expand past Germany. These promises were since broken, and leading US national security figures openly dream of regime change inside Russia itself. Fast forward to 2013, when pro-EU protesters took aim at Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, who was playing the EU and Russia.
So he's going to touch on the Maidan coup here, which was in 2014. The U.S. government helped overthrow the democratic elected government of Ukraine. And that's really where this crisis has sparked off. There's been a civil war for 8 years since then. So this war didn't start this week. It didn't start last week. It started 2014. And the history goes way further than 2014. But this specific conflict goes back to 2014 and the Maidan coup.
each other and wanted Ukraine to stay out of NATO. After Yanukovych announced a deal with some in the opposition, the more extreme elements, led by literal armed Nazis, seized the president's palace. These protesters were openly supported by American politicians and ushered in a new far-right, anti-Russian government that aggressively sought Ukraine's membership in NATO. From Russia's perspective, you can see why this coup in Ukraine was so serious. Russia was already surrounded by NATO countries, and foreign powers invaded Russia through Ukraine in both world wars. The admission of Ukraine would mean that any future clash on Russia's border would trigger mutual defense obligations for all NATO members and essentially produce World War III. On top of that, when people in the eastern Ukrainian region called the Donbass rejected the new coup government and saw closer ties with Russia, a civil war began. Fighting in Donbass has gone on for 7 years and claimed over 14,000 lives. For those 7 years, Russia worked to uphold the Minsk Agreement, which was supposed to deliver peace by giving the eastern part of the country autonomy. This never happened, and the fighting escalated again, which is what brings us to today. So, whatever you think of this specific decision, the history is clear. At every step of the way, this conflict was instigated and inflamed by NATO's aggression. So if the US and EU really want to see a peaceful resolution to the tensions in Ukraine, their first step should be to disband this relic of the Cold War.
So I think they did a great video breakdown there. Perfectly kind of cues up what we're going to talk about. So let's start here. Reasonable statecraft. I was there. NATO and the origins of the Ukraine crisis. After the fall of the Soviet Union, I told the Senate that expansion would lead us to where we are today. And this is written by Jeff F. Matlock Jr. Who's Jeff F. Matlock? Or Jack Matlock. Sorry, Jack. He's a career diplomat who served as the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union from 87 to 91. Prior to that, he was senior director for European and Soviet affairs on President Reagan's National Security Council. U.S. ambassador to Czechoslovakia from 81 to 83. Keenan professor at the Institute for Advanced Study. Written numerous articles, 3 books about the negotiations that ended the Cold War, disintegration of the Soviet Union, and U.S. foreign policy following the end of the Cold War. In short, an expert. This quote here, he's talking about Vladimir Putin. His demands is that the process of adding new members to NATO cease and that Russia has assurance that Ukraine and Georgia will never be members. So that's Putin. His demands are that the process of expanding NATO cease and that Russia be given the assurance that both Ukraine and Georgia would never become members because they are directly on the border of Russia. President Biden has refused to give such assurance, but made clear his willingness to continue discussing questions of strategic stability in Europe. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government has made it clear it has no intentions of implementing the agreement reached in 2015 for reuniting the Donbas regions in Ukraine with a large degree of local autonomy, an agreement with Russia, France, and Germany that the United States endorsed. So Putin's demands seem pretty simple. Biden refusing to give such assurances, Ukraine refusing to give such assurances, and Ukraine also violating the Minsk Accords, the Minsk Agreement, that would have paved the way for peace and allowed these 2 Donbas regions to reunite with Ukraine and have some local autonomy. All right. Instead, what they did was they have been shelling and sniping the Donbas regions. They started a civil war. That's what Ukraine did. So let's continue. Here we have a nice infographic that's going to show us NATO expanding. So let's get it popping here. So in 1949, NATO is founded, right? And we have the original countries are like America, America, France, Great Britain, I think Norway, and a couple others, right? In 52, they begin expanding again. They expand and they add Greece and Turkey. And then in 55, the Warsaw Pact, so like the mirrored equivalent of NATO, forms in the socialist bloc. And in 55, NATO adds a recently denazified West Germany into their military alliance. So the country that, you know, anyway, let's keep going. So 91, you know, there was, in 62, Albania left the Warsaw Pact. In 82, we added Spain. So like very little movement, a couple of small movements here and there. There were some major additions, and then the whole Warsaw Pact happened, right? But 91, the Soviet Union dissolved. That's a whole other story. It didn't happen in a vacuum. And the people who benefited from the dissolution, you know, a lot of them are from the West. But anyway, 91, Soviet Union dissolves, Warsaw Pact gone. You would think there would no longer be a need for NATO, but what happens instead? NATO explodes. And then it eventually encompasses many states that were previously in the Warsaw Pact. So NATO has now expanded to the border of Russia. And obviously that's a security concern for Russia. But it's not just NATO expanding country to country. It's also the United States and its imperialism. The United States is constantly expanding bases, constantly deploying troops in foreign lands, constantly shipping in heavy weapons to proxies, as well as placing missiles throughout Europe. But here's an article from back in 2015 in Politico. Where in the world is the U.S. military? Despite recently closing hundreds of bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States still maintains nearly 800 military bases in more than 70 countries and territories abroad. From giant little Americas to small radar facilities, Britain, France, and Russia, by contrast, have about 30 foreign bases combined. And here we have a little bit of a map. It gives you kind of an idea of current breakdown between NATO aligned countries, Russia, and we have some NATO bases on the maps that contain nukes, NATO bases that don't contain nukes. These are all these dots are U.S. bases. These are United States bases outside of the United States. There's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Russia has about 8 bases outside of their country, and they're all almost right on their border in heavy Russianized regions. Anyway, this just goes to show how these two powers, these two industrial, economic, and military powers have their spheres of influence. The United States is obviously vastly greater. It's all the way across an ocean, and its sphere of influence is now right up on the border of Russia, whose, you know, more traditional sphere of influence used to encompass more of Eastern Europe. But let's listen to this video here. Let's listen to Chomsky talk about Russia and Ukraine all the way back after what happened in 2008. Excuse me, what happened after Crimea.
Gorbachev made a remarkable concession. He agreed to allow unified Germany to join a Western military alliance. You think about history, that's pretty astonishing. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia a couple of times in century. Now he was saying unified militarized Germany can join a hostile military alliance. There was a quid pro quo, a condition that NATO would not move, the phrase was 1 inch to the east. That meant East Germany. Okay, so NATO would not move to East Germany. That was the quid pro quo. NATO immediately moved to East Germany. Gorbachev was pretty upset, but he was informed by President Bush, Bush #1, and James Baker, Secretary of State, that this was just a verbal agreement. There was nothing on paper. And the implication, they didn't say it, but the implication is if you're dumb enough to accept a verbal gentleman's agreement with the United States, that's your problem. So NATO moved, he didn't say that, I'm adding it. NATO moved to East Germany. Clinton came in, NATO moved further towards the right, to the borders of Russia, all the way along. Actually, a question that we ought to be asking ourselves is why did NATO even exist after 1990?
That's the point.
Throughout the whole history of the Cold War, we were told NATO is necessary to defend Western Europe from the Russian hordes, okay? No more Russian hordes. What happens to NATO? It expands, okay? It expands to the east. Its mission changed. Its official mission now is not to defend Europe from the Russian hordes. It's to control the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines, and to serve as a U.S.-run intervention force. Well, you know, we're all educated intellectuals. We can now ask a question. What was the nature of the propaganda we were fed all those years? I mean, if NATO was there to defend the West from the Russians, why is it now expanding right to the borders of Russia, becoming a global U.S. intervention force, protecting sea lanes and pipelines and so on? What that tells us is all the talk about the Cold War was just a pure lie. And there's plenty more evidence for that, which we could go into. Educated intellectuals don't pursue this line of thought, but it's a pretty obvious one. Well, going on to Ukraine, Mearsheimer's point is that for any Russian leader, whoever it might be, you know, Mahatma Gandhi, Ukraine is right at the core of their geostrategic concerns. For Ukraine to be taken into NATO, which is what is repeatedly threatened, would be a very serious threat to Russian security, quite apart from historical interests, which go way back, the origins of the Russian Empire, in fact. So yeah, you can give arguments against Russian interference in eastern Ukraine after the coup that took place there, but it's a complicated story, and the West is not without its significant initiatives there.
Why does NATO even exist anymore? Soviet Union's gone. NATO continues on, expands, and its mission changes. It becomes a defender of sea lanes and pipelines and a tool of an American intervention, military intervention. That's not me. That's Noam Chomsky. So these NATO expansions are also further inflamed by recent treaty developments, specifically Donald Trump. So while the news media was telling you how Donald Trump is Putin's puppet, continuing to this day to do it, even though he's not president right now and, you know, has no power, can't even talk on the internet, they continue to obsess over Trump, loves Putin, he served Putin, he's Putin's agenda, doing everything for Putin. Trump ripped up crucial treaties that were groundbreaking in reducing nuclear arms, protecting Europe, having cooperation with Russia. Trump was openly hostile to Russia in very, very important ways. One of them, the INF. U.S. formally withdraws from nuclear treaty with Russia and prepares to test new missile. The United States formally withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia Friday, as the U.S. military prepares to test a new non-nuclear mobile-launched cruise missile developed specifically to challenge Moscow in Europe, according to a U.S. senior defense official. This is back in 2019. Donald Trump, Putin's puppet, ripping up crucial treaties between us and Russia, and flaming tensions with a nuclear power. So what was the INF, though? The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The INF Treaty, negotiated and signed by the U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, was one of the most far-reaching and successful nuclear arms reduction agreements in history. The treaty led to a verifiable elimination of 2,692 U.S. and Soviet missiles based in Europe. It helped bring an end to the Cold War nuclear arms race and paved the way for agreements to slash bloated strategic nuclear arsenals and withdraw thousands of tactical nuclear weapons from forward deployed areas. The Pact serves as an important check on some of the most destabilizing types of nuclear weapons that the United States and Russia could deploy. INF-class missiles, whether nuclear armed or conventionally armed, are destabilizing because they can strike targets deep inside Russia and in Western Europe with little or no warning. Their short time to target capacity increases the risk of miscalculation in a crisis. These missiles, the intermediate range missiles, can hit targets, going from Europe to Russia in 6 to 11 minutes, or vice versa, 6 to 11 minutes, right? It leaves little or no time to figure out, if you do get a blip on the radar, is this real? Is this not? Do we have time to react? Do we have time to not? It shortens that window of opportunity to not do nuclear Armageddon and makes it even smaller if we do get to the point where things are that hostile, okay? It also opens a slippery slope up of where now we're starting to develop nuclear weapons that become smaller and smaller range, possibly smaller and smaller in capacity as those ranges get smaller. And eventually you're getting to small scale tactical nuclear devices. And the danger of that is, use a small scale tactical nuclear device and then, the opposite side retaliates with a nuclear device that's just one level above that. And, you're destroying an acre, a block, a mountain, a country, and then it's, nuclear Armageddon and the atmosphere is on fire. So the INF Treaty was super important. We ripped that up, and we have been now developing these medium-range weapons and pumping them back into Europe. We removed a whole class of weapons out of Europe. That makes everyone safer. And we went back on that. We went back on that first. It was us. Here's a map just showing, the thousands of missiles that were removed under the INF Treaty. The Open Skies Treaty was also ripped up by the Trump administration. And here's Open Skies at a glance. Open Skies Treaty permits each state party to conduct short notice, unarmed reconnaissance flights over each other's entire territories to collect data on military forces and activities. So basically, it's allowing nations to spy on each other with tactical satellites or tactical reconnaissance aircraft. It's like a gesture of goodwill and good faith and saying, like, look, we're not amassing troops on your border. You can fly right over and check it out. That kind of thing. Treaty status. The Open Skies Treaty entered into force on January 1st, 2002. The United States withdrew from the treaty in November 2020, and Russia withdrew in December 2021, which left 32 states remaining in the accord. So another treaty ripped up by Putin's puppet, Trump. The media will have you thinking you know, Trump definitely admires strongmen. He like definitely admires Putin, but his policies were not pro-Putin. He didn't serve Putin with American policies. He just didn't. He was very hawkish to Russia. And, you know, that's another part of the reason why we are where we are. In fact, when Trump took office, Obama started the coup in Ukraine with Joe Biden. He initially armed all of these right-wing militias, but then he cut the supplies off. He didn't want to give them anti-tank missiles. He didn't want to do all this stuff because he realized he had started a proxy war with Russia right on their border, and he realized that the militants that they were arming were Nazis, and he didn't want to do that. So that was one of the smart things that Obama did, one of the few smart things that he did. And when Trump came in, everyone's calling him Putin's puppet. You know, Hillary makes up that Russia did everything to cover her own tracks of her rigging elections and all of that. So what does he do? He comes in and goes, I'm Putin's puppet. You guys want a bunch of weapons for Ukraine? Boom, go ahead. Gives them billions of dollars and further inflames the situation in Ukraine. Just a quick aside, all right? So we have been escalating. NATO has been expanding. We have been ripping up nuclear treaties, and we've been pumping armaments into Eastern Europe. But hey, maybe you think we're the good guys. Maybe you think we're NATO, we're America, we're the good guys, we're team good guys. Russia's team bad guys. NATO's never done anything bad. They're a defensive alliance. Well, you'd be wrong, okay? Let's talk about Yugoslavia. Depleted uranium, that's nice. That's how America helps. That's how NATO helps. They drop 28,000 bombs on you, you know, injure 12,000, kill 5,000, blow up thousands of homes or whatever, schools, bridges, they don't care. Hit you with depleted uranium so people, you know, have birth defects and cancer for years and years to come. Let's go back to the AP, the Associated Press archives. Let's hear what the Pentagon was saying and doing. What were they showing the press around that time?
Update again. The next video I'll show you will be a highway bridge attacked in southern Serbia, 5 miles north of the Kosovo border. This is the Raska Bridge. F-15Es with 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs. This is at night. It looks like day because of the infrared, and he destroys that bridge. That was 3 days ago. We're not focusing on the population of the Serb civilian population. We're focusing on the military, and that's Milosevic's military. Any of those things that help him sustain his capability to engage in repressive acts against the Kosovo Albanians that has to do with military targeting is fair game. We've gone through those before, and it's regrettable if it's affecting their civilian population. But I think that's in the hands of Milosevic, and that's his decision to make. You can see in the cursor, he's tracking the building. On this film, I want you to notice on the bottom, just
the building
bomb impact, in about 4 seconds, you'll see 4 more bombs from other aircraft into the screen that hit their targets. And these here have a direct hit. All those bombs were direct hits with no collateral damage.
None.
But I guess from a personal perspective, I would tell Milosevic that if you don't understand we're committed by now, you probably ought to start reading.
These guys don't miss. Shooting 100%.
Aircraft. First one here I'll go through right now is an F-16 on an APC, Armored Personnel Carrier in the depth and breadth of Serbia, and will continue to do that even as we continue to go after it.
But I do believe that the collateral damage which has been done by NATO is at an absolute minimum, and we take great care in both targeting and in terms of the application of firepower to ensure that collateral damage does not occur. And so if anybody gets the idea that we in any way are responsible for most of the damage to civilian facilities that are not legitimate targets at Pristina, they have the wrong idea.
You got the wrong idea, Jack. This is from Washington Post staff writers, Tuesday, May 25th, 1999. NATO warplanes jolt Yugoslav power grid. Belgrade, May 24th. NATO airstrikes on Yugoslavia's power grid left millions of people without electricity or water service today, bringing the war over Kosovo more directly into the lives of civilians across the country. 3 consecutive nights of air attacks caused extensive blackouts in Belgrade, Novi Sad, and Niš, the 3 largest cities in Serbia. Sorry if I'm saying that all wrong. Yugoslavia's dominant republic. In contrast with previous attacks on the power supply, in which Allied warplanes triggered temporary outages by dropping carbon fiber filaments that shorted out electrical lines, NATO forces this time struck at Serbia's 5 major power transmission stations with high explosive munitions, causing damage that could take weeks to repair. Officials at the Pentagon and at NATO headquarters in Belgium said Allied jets deliberately attacked the power grid, aiming to shut it down more completely and for longer periods than any time previously in the 2-month air campaign. U.S. officials estimated that the attacks had shut off power to about 80% of Serbia. Allied officials said the attacks were intended to disrupt operations by the Serb-led Yugoslav military in Kosovo, the focus of the conflict, and not to target civilians. But by increasing the hardship of ordinary citizens, alliance leaders also appeared to be seeking to encourage public disaffection with the government of Yugoslav President Milosevic. Here in Belgrade, where rage against NATO during the initial days of the 3-month-old bombing campaign has lapsed into weariness for many residents, the prospect of sustained blackouts brought renewed anger towards the alliance. Some cited the power outages as evidence that the genuine aim of NATO is not to expel Yugoslav troops and Serbian special police units from Kosovo, but to punish civilians and to wreck the country. I don't know, do I need to add anything there? So NATO did Yugoslavia. NATO also did Afghanistan. The ISAF was one of the largest coalitions in history and is NATO's most challenging mission to date. At its height, the force was more than 130,000 strong, with troops from 51 NATO and partner nations. I mean, we don't even need to go into how many people we killed in Afghanistan, all the drone strikes, all the misery to what? Replace the Taliban with the Taliban? Steal a bunch of poppy and mineral, you know? NATO also did Libya. Don't forget this. From Deutsche Welle. Libya still plagued by conflict 10 years after NATO intervention. In 2011, the international community supported rebel forces against Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. But hopes of democracy and stability have yet to be fulfilled. Yeah, they've yet to be fulfilled. The hopes of democracy, right? Remember what Hillary had to say after we toppled this foreign government in Libya. I mean, the reason why we toppled this foreign government was not a humanitarian intervention. What they really did was they took out Gaddafi. I mean, first they asked for his nuclear weapons years ago to make him an easier target. And like a dumbass, he gave up his nuclear weapons because he believed in diplomacy. The United States doesn't. He gave up his nuclear weapons. 10 years later, they do an intervention. They take him out. They bomb his forces to oblivion to the point where rebels, a lot of which are not even Libyans, drag him into the streets and murder him and stick a sword up his ass in broad daylight and broadcast it to the world. Why did we do that? Because Gaddafi was building a strong African nation, strong anti-Western nation that was also developing its own currency and was looking to sell and purchase its shares of oil in its own currency, no longer using the US dollar, threatening the strength of the petrodollar and of, Western nations. So what they did was they went in and they blew him up. They blew him up. And here, let's listen to what Hillary had to say after she, after we witnessed Gaddafi get murdered and anally raped in his last moments on Earth.
I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed videos.
We came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
Oh, I'm sure it did.
Let this be a reminder that Putin is a murderer. What's the state of Libya? I mean, what is the state of Libya all these years later? Somewhere in Libya, August 2017.
Big strong boys for farm work, he says. 400. 700. 700. 800. The numbers roll in. These men are sold for 1,200 Libyan pounds, $400 apiece. You are watching an auction of human beings.
So Libya is now open slave markets. Something that never would have happened when Gaddafi was ruling the nation. And that's objective fact and reality. So Putin here, we have an expansion of NATO. We have the ripping up of crucial arms treaties, nuclear treaties, and we have NATO's history as an aggressive offensive military alliance doing military interventions at the behest of the United States and its military and economic interests. Is Putin's invasion of Ukraine legal or righteous? No. But to say it's unprovoked or it's happening in a vacuum or to characterize him as an arch villain, hell-bent on world domination, or even revitalizing the Soviet Empire are all patently false. I mean, NATO has incorporated some of the former Soviet states into NATO. So if they're saying Putin wants to restart the Soviet Empire, they're saying by default that he wants to start World War III. That's just not, objective reality does not bear that out as fact at all. This war is illegal. It's bad. I hate war. I hate to see people die, but it's not unprovoked. And it is one of his last steps. I think he could have done other things. I think he could have tried to leverage the economic pull he has over Europe through fossil fuels. But, I'm not in his position. I don't know all the facts on the ground. I just don't think the war was, ever the right choice unless, it's defensive. But at the same time, the United States designed for this to happen. This was the United States' dream. We set up all the pieces. We stranglehold Russia into a corner. We back them into a very dangerous spot where their own future of self-determination as a nation is at risk, let alone having their own sphere of influence and being a regional empire. Their existence as a nation is at risk with the provocations of NATO. And we need to understand that as Westerners. The narrative that he's an evil guy, that this is all very black and white and cartoonish is completely wrong. It disregards all of history, and it will put us in a position where we're only cheering on more weapons and pushing ourselves into a deeper, darker conflict and further risking nuclear warfare.